Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Doug Silliman, the President and CEO of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. And it goes without saying that we find ourselves in extraordinary times. As academics, think tankers, practitioners, and concerned citizens, we must not only shed light on the major issues facing this country and the world, but we must adjust to the reality of life in the time of coronavirus. With the onslaught of COVID-19, we have no greater responsibility than to care for our families, our coworkers, our participants, and our societies. So here at AGSIW, we are adapting our programming for this new reality. Today is our first completely remote live video program, and we will do many more of these in the coming weeks. This program will be a little bit different than our usual live event. Only the moderator and the panelists will be able to speak to the group, but we want to make sure that all of you can participate by asking questions. We ask that you pose your questions to the panelists in writing using one of the following options. You can email your question to info@agsiw.org, or you can tweet to @GulfStatesInst, or you can email your question to the address that you received in your confirmation email. Please identify yourself in your post and direct your question to a specific panelist if you'd like to. Our moderator will collect the questions and pose them on your behalf to the panelists. Even in these challenging times, AGSIW is committed to bringing you the most timely, informed, and expert analysis on the most salient issues that affect the Arab Gulf states and their relationships with the United States and the rest of the world. So without any more delay, I want to turn this program over to AGSIW visiting scholar Emma Soubrier to introduce our distinguished panel and to run the program. Emma, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's extremely exciting to be part of this first webinar entirely online for AGSIW. This is, I think, one of the silver lining of what's happening now is that we get to test all those new technologies and ways to do conferences, and to have all of you not in the room but in the Zoom together is really nice. So thank you to all of those speakers for accepting to participate in this exercise, and all of the audience, all of you in the audience, for being here per se. And I'm excited to be today talking about one of the important trends in the Gulf at the moment, which is the diversification of defense and security cooperation schemes as Gulf countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, are increasingly looking at non-Western countries such as Russia, China, India, or South Africa, but also countries closer to home, such as Egypt and Turkey, for their arms transfers and security agreements, or even quote-unquote strategic partnerships. So with me today to talk about these important topics, we have Jon. So everyone, you can find the bio for everyone on our website. But so yeah, here is Jon Alterman from CSIS, and Alexandra Kuimova from SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and Shana Marshall from the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University, Bilal Saab at Middle East Institute, and Pieter Wezeman from SIPRI. So thank you all very much for being here, and what I propose is that we dive right in. So I think I'm going to first turn to you, Pieter. If you could talk to us a little bit about the diversification of arms supplies of the Gulf countries. So maybe talk a little bit about evolving arms imports trends in the Gulf amidst broader shifts of the global arms trade.
Yeah, let's have a quick look at maybe what hasn't changed first. Right now, whatever we say now and whatever we see and potential change is that the main suppliers to the Gulf countries, and that's Kuwait, Bahrain, the UAE, and of course Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, remain still the US and Western Europe. They have been there for a long time. They have been the main suppliers for a long time. They have also been not just the suppliers of the weapons, but also the suppliers of the training, and increasingly in recent years, in particular in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the suppliers of technology, the manpower, the people, even the managers that are building up the arms industry in particularly those two countries. Now, at the same time, we see also that several other players have, over time, tried to become players in those countries too. Some have tried already for a long time. Take, for example, a country like China, which already managed to sell ballistic missiles to Saudi Arabia in the 1980s, and then basically disappeared there again. But still, that's an example. We have also seen how Russia has tried very hard in the UAE. And we see other players, as you already mentioned, Turkey, which has, of course, very kind of off-and-on relationships with different countries in the region, but also there the arms trade has become part of the way Turkey tries to build up its relations in the Gulf region. And then we have new players, for example, a country like South Korea, which is rapidly building up an arms industry, and I think also is trying to play a role in the region. When these outside players come in, or these new players, such as China or Russia right now, they seem to be primarily capable of entering that market, you could say, by offering niche products. Just like China already did in the 1980s, it supplied ballistic missiles, which the US absolutely did not want to supply. On the contrary, they tried hard to stop that. And that is something I think we see now too, where the US says we're not willing to supply armed drones. China can come in as one of the very, very few other suppliers of such armed drones and kind of capture that niche market. And from there, we have to see if this is going to develop into a true, let's say, impact in which particularly China, but maybe also Russia, will play a bigger role in the Gulf countries than we have seen until now. But right now, it's still very much kind of in the balance there. There's no direct evidence that they have already succeeded in doing so.
Great. Thank you very much. And maybe Alexandra, if I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about the fluctuating positions, more specifically of Russia and China, or also Turkey in the regional markets, and the role played by emerging countries such as South Africa and India, specifically in the Gulf, to maybe complete.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Emma, and I'm happy to answer your question. And of course, I would like to start with some developments related to Russia and China, because Russia and China are among the top 10 arms exporters in the world. Russia is currently the second largest arms supplier, and China is the fifth. So overall, in recent years, Russia and China have shown an increased interest in the Gulf region. Both countries are willing to develop cooperation with the Gulf states, mostly within two main areas, which are security cooperation and economic cooperation, which include cooperation in investments, oil and gas sectors, development in arms trade relations, and arms industry cooperation. But since we talked today about arms trade, I would like to provide you with some developments and answer your question about the role of Russia, China, and other suppliers. So we'll say a couple of words about arms trade. So as Pieter has mentioned, Western countries, including the US, France, United Kingdom, and Germany, have traditionally dominated the market for arms in the Gulf region. For example, over the past 5-year period, 2015-19, the US accounted for 68% of all imports to the UAE and 73% of Saudi Arabia arms imports, while Russia and China accounted for less than 1% for the same period. So you can see that the difference is quite huge. However, although the share of Russian and Chinese arms in all imports by the Gulf states is tiny, both countries have made several important steps towards arms trade cooperation. A good example would be, for example, a meeting between Russia and Saudi Arabia, when Russia and Saudi Arabia reached a preliminary agreement for the potential acquisition of Russian weapons, for example, S-400 air defense system, and possible transfers of technologies. And in 2019, for the first time, Russia exported major arms to Saudi Arabia. However, the transfer was the only a limited number of specialized rocket launchers of a type not available from other suppliers. In addition, another example that Russia and the UAE are having discussions about the co-development of a combat aircraft based on the Soviet era MiG-29. And moreover, both countries have signed an agreement of intent for the purchase of Su-35 combat aircraft from Russia. However, I should say that even though there are some discussions about procurement of S-400 defense system for Saudi Arabia or Su-35 for the UAE, no orders have been placed, and most likely it will not happen in the near future for obvious reasons, how the US or Western suppliers, other Western suppliers will react. However, I should say that these developments may serve as a good indicator showing Russia's intentions to flag its interest in the Gulf states. As for China, China has now clearly emerged as a competitor to Russia and Western arms exporters with regards to arms sales. As for the Gulf region, China is one of the smallest arms suppliers. Although the share of imports from China is very small, the number of countries that China supplied weapons to increased the last 5-year period, because, for example, in 2010-2014, China supplied the weapons just to the UAE, and in 2015-19, China supplied weapons to Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. Speaking of Turkey, since we're also talking about smaller arms suppliers, Turkey right now is the 14th largest arms supplier in the world. And in 2015-19, Oman was the second largest arms recipient of Turkish arms. In addition, Turkey supplies smaller weapons to smaller number of weapons to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Bahrain. But what is interesting is that Turkey is willing to develop arms industry cooperation with some of the Gulf countries. And a good example, for example, the cooperation with Qatar and the Turkish-Qatari private venture BMC, where Turkey is trying to produce new generation main battle tank, including for export. And the last but not least, developments in South Africa and India. So India and South Africa have expressed clear ambitions to develop their arms production capabilities and furthermore increase their arms export. But yet South Africa and India are the 22nd and 23rd largest arms suppliers in the world. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates account for at least a third of South Africa's arms exports. As for India, India is trying to develop security and defense relations with the Gulf states. And just to conclude for 30 seconds, from recipient perspectives, why arms from Russia, for example, China, are important in a way for the Gulf states? First of all, lack of domestic technological basis needed to design and produce advanced weapons. So countries in the Gulf region need some technologies that they can import from Russia or China, for example. Second reason is that Western suppliers sometimes can limit or seize sell weapons to countries for political or humanitarian reasons, but Russia or China can provide weapons without or with just a few conditions about domestic affairs. And of course, diversification of sources of arms suppliers can allow the Gulf states to get some benefit from competition in terms of prices and conditions. So relationship with Russia or China, for example, can serve as a bargaining tool for the Gulf states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And I think, yeah, we're going to come back to the reason behind those emerging strategies. Thank you very much. To kind of finish the overview of the emerging trends, I was wondering, Shana, if you could maybe talk about the other new dynamics, namely the emergence and implication of intra-regional arms trade, including growing exports from some of the Gulf countries, and what it actually has as an impact on the region. Thank you.
So as other speakers have indicated, there's sort of a level of continuation here as well. So we should think of this as a continuation of some previous patterns. So there's always been intra-regional movement of arms, right? So the Gulf states historically have often paid for and financed arms transfers from the US and Europe to go to places like Jordan and Egypt and Lebanon, right? So they may be selling them weapons now, but historically they've also paid for them to be shipped from the US and Europe to these allied sort of regional non-Gulf monarchies and authoritarian republics. You also have enormous, of course, smuggling and proliferation incidents historically, which also produced a lot of the intra-regional spread of weapons. And then, of course, several historical efforts to sort of create small sort of pockets of regional production of material that could then form the basis for the intra-regional trade in things like munitions and other sort of basic elements. So you have, of course, the Arab Organization for Industrialization, which was meant to use GCC capital, GCC money, and Egyptian military labor and factories and industrial capacities to produce a regional arms center that could then supply the Middle East. And also similar efforts in Saudi Arabia to use some of their relationships with US weapons suppliers in the 80s and 90s to establish similar domestic enterprises that would produce some of these basic items. You have the UAE, of course, engaging in a lot of joint ventures in the region with places like Jordan and Algeria, and then being able to export those items, which have shown up in Libya and Yemen and lots of other places. Those are historically new, I think, in many ways, in large part because the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been sort of treated like a piggy bank or an industrial sort of slush fund by the US and European defense firms, which always saw them as a major source of capital support for really a post-industrial economy. Most of the, of course, growth now in the US and Europe is from financial corporations, not industrial corporations. And so the purchases made by Gulf states has always really played into very much the maintenance of some sort of industrial base in the US and Europe. And I think that the GCC governments have come to resent that to a significant degree. And so a lot of the production of domestic items regionally and the effort to supply allies regionally is not just about sort of strategic foreign policy goals, but also about trying to, as much as possible, sort of loosen that grip that the US and Europe have had on the region in terms of the supply of arms and then the transfer of capital from the Gulf states to the US and Europe in exchange for those weapons. And then what's also quite obvious is that the spread of weapons regionally, this intra-regional trade and proliferation and joint partnerships is also very much about extending what I think is the near abroad of the Gulf states. So a definite interest in the politics and commercial activities in places like the Horn of Africa. And the further you can sort of spread those intra-regional weapons transfers and form those relationships, the broader your sphere of influence becomes sort of geographically. And so I think that's also part of what's driving this as well, in addition to the obvious decline of U.S. Imperial sort of power in the region.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's going to be a very important point to talk about what are the ins and also outs of those new trends, but why the Gulf countries turn to new partners. Before that, I think it would be very important to look at what the ins and outs are for the outside powers. So I would like to turn to Jon to ask, beyond the arms sales that we've been talking about, what about the establishment of quote unquote strategic partnerships with a broader range of powers with ambitions for new or renewed regional engagement? Obviously talking about Russia and China most of all, but also whichever country.
I mean, the nomenclature of strategic partnerships, or what the Chinese call comprehensive strategic partnerships, is really something that Chinese have pioneered. Nobody's really sure what a comprehensive strategic partnership is, except a lot of countries want them. Their current comprehensive strategic partnerships are with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and Egypt. The Qataris were sort of put out that the Chinese wouldn't make a comprehensive strategic partnership. They're merely strategic partners. Again, nobody really knows what it is, but there's a sense that China is a growing force in the region. China is a growing force in the world. Most of the growth in world energy demand comes out of China. China is the #1 trading partner of most of the world, certainly most of the countries in the Middle East. And there really is this sense of exploration for what it could mean, partly because of a sense that China is rising, certainly a sense that the US is declining. I think countries in the Middle East are concerned that both the sort of America first attitude they hear more about, combined with US energy self-sufficiency, will allow the United States to turn away from the Middle East. And what really grabbed people in the Gulf in October was not the president's unilateral decision to pull out of Syria. They were much more concerned strategically with the president repeating his mantra that we have wasted $8 trillion in the Middle East, and it was the biggest mistake to ever get involved. So sort of in light of that, and there have been things that preceded it and things that followed it, I think there's a broad sense in the region that have to hedge their bets against the US being there. And China is an obvious country to hedge with. I think Russia may be tactically helpful, and certainly a Russia relationship is good if you want to put pressure on the United States. The US won't sell you something, the Russians will sell it to you. And we've seen that with the S-400 missile systems. We've seen it, I think we're starting to see it more with Saudi Arabia, with the nuclear program. There's a sense, I think, that Russia, while it's not a desirable principal alternative partner, can be a useful tactical element. Strategically, China is seen as a country that's going to be much more important in the world going forward. And doesn't it make sense to lash oneself up with China, not to get rid of the United States, not to supplant the United States, but supplement the United States, unless and until the United States shows that it's really committed to the region. I think from a Chinese perspective, there are a few things going on. One is that simply the Chinese feel a need to secure their own energy. And it's a vulnerability for China to rely on the United States to secure China's access to Middle Eastern energy. Part of Belt and Road, part of China's approach to Iran is about getting an overland source for energy that the US can't interrupt. Part of it, too, is a sense that American hegemony isn't really in China's interest, and to the extent, for example, that US tensions with Iran not only draw US attention away from the Western Pacific, but also put a wedge between the US and Asian and European allies. That's great for China. And so there's a sort of utilitarian aspect that China's interested in pursuing Middle East relationships to pull the United States away from traditional allies. There's also an interest in just, this is a part of the world they think people are going to make money. I mean, they see Iran as a place for greenfield investment. Everybody's not talking about Iran, so as a counterintuitive bet, they think the Iranian economy is actually a decent place to invest. And when Iran gets over its isolation in the world, they will benefit from Iran's growth. They've been able to do all this by not annoying anybody. They have close relationships with the Iranians and the Israelis and the Saudis. Go figure. So it's all working. I think the interesting thing for China is, does there come a point where they can't continue to play that game? The Chinese desire is they don't become a security guarantor for the region. And as a Chinese diplomat sarcastically explained to me in the Chinese embassy in Algiers about 10 years ago, how about you do security and we do business? They don't they don't want to become the security guarantor. Will there come a time when the regional states will feel we just can't get what we need from China? We need other relationships. We can't rely on the Chinese, or will the Chinese economic growth be enough to propel? What if Chinese economic growth slows down? What does that do to China's growth in the region? What if China, through all its alternative energy exploration, because the Middle East is a vulnerability, they rely not only on a region that's unstable, they rely on the United States to secure a region that's unstable on their behalf. If they can figure out a way not to need hydrocarbons, what does that do to Chinese interests in the Middle East? So it seems to me that this is more of a question mark. What we've seen in the last 20 years is what an Asian foreign minister memorably described as, China's been winning without fighting in the Middle East for 20 years. The United States has been fighting without winning in the Middle East for 20 years. And so it makes a lot of sense for the Middle Eastern states to get closer to China. How close they will get, how close China will want to be, I think are things that people take for granted, but strike me more as question marks in the years ahead.
Thank you, and I think it's a perfect transition, because you have pointed out that one of the interests of China is to put a wedge between U.S. and traditional allies, and also push into the Middle East. But I think an important aspect of that is what the U.S. is doing, and especially from a European perspective right now, I would argue that the U.S. is also putting a wedge between them and their traditional allies. So that the role of the U.S., I think, is really important. And I would turn to Bilal for that, kind of to explain this multipolarization. There are obviously a lot of different explanations for this increasing multipolarization, and I think one of them is the limits or failures of traditional partnerships. So I would turn to Bilal to talk about this. Thank you.
Right. Well, hi everybody, and thank you, Emma, for the invitation. It's an honor to be with such a distinguished group of people. So I think Jon has already alluded to it. A lot of this is driven by concerns, fears, and opportunity, right? And just sound logic. I mean, you never want to put all your eggs in one basket, right? And the concerns being, and these are not new, that there's been decreased confidence in U.S. leadership in the region, and particularly its role and security commitment to these Gulf partners. I typically refer to 3 instances in the U.S. Gulf Partnership, which this year celebrates its 75th anniversary. It is one of the oldest in the world, and typically, even with full-fledged military alliances, I mean, they have an average of 15 years. This one is 75 years old. It is quite resilient. I mean, it has survived a number of crises throughout the years, including 9/11. It's based on some pretty firm political strategic understandings. You know, we are physically there. in the region, offering them protection, strong economic ties, as many of the panelists have already mentioned, and yet, far too many times there have been some pretty serious breakdowns in security coordination between the two sides. And by security coordination, I mean also consultation on some pretty monumental decisions that we have made in the region that have had pretty significant ramifications on the security of the Gulf partners. Typically, people refer to as a most important example as the Obama nuclear deal with the Iranians, as as a development that the Gulf partners were not only not pleased with, but they simply didn't know much about, right? I mean, all those negotiations were being conducted in secrecy, confidentiality. We would brief the Gulf partners about, developments, but we would never consult with them in the sense that we would seek their input, try to assuage their concerns. But this is not when it started, surprisingly. This crisis of confidence or trust started with the second term of the Bush administration. President Bush really, at no point in the 2 terms over which he presided, was considering seriously attacking Iran. But in the second term, I mean, he did face some pretty significant pressure from some people from his own cabinet and, of course, the Israelis to at least consider a military attack against Iran to stop its nuclear program. At no point during that time, and he admitted in his memoirs that he was actually considering attacking the Iranians, and he even asked the Pentagon to come up with plans. Just read Bob Woodward and other credible sources. But at no point during that process, I should emphasize, did he actually consult with the Gulfies and tell them that there is a possibility of us going to war against Iran, so let's plan together, not at least to fight together, but at least for the day after, right? And how can we better shield you from whatever consequences that may take place? This is when the crisis of confidence started. And then it escalated with the Obama administration nuclear deal. And then the third major breakdown in security coordination was with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. Once again, the Gulf partners find themselves completely in the dark about a monumental security decision that the United States has taken without consulting them. Now, of course, nobody's going to shed tears in the Gulf about the death of Soleimani, but they were quite concerned that such a major decision was taken without alerting them in advance. Now, of course, there are many reasons for all of these security breakdowns, okay? I'm not going to go all over them, and including policy divergences, right? Shifting domestic politics in the United States. We have a new priority now of competing with China and Russia. The Middle East is less of a priority for us, and operational considerations. You don't really tip anybody about a high-level assassination in advance because you don't want to reduce the likelihood of success. High-level negotiations with another country, also you don't want to share as much information about that as possible to just maintain the confidentiality of it. I understand all those things, but given the length of this partnership, given how close relations have been, at least from the security domain, it's quite remarkable that on 3 monumental episodes in the partnership, the United States did not coordinate with its Gulf partners, which has left a pretty gaping wound, frankly, in the relationship that has in many ways led to what we all were talking about here, basically, in terms of pushing them to start thinking of others, other protectors, diversifying their security portfolio, and seeking other sorts of protection. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I was looking for my unmute button. Still new at this. Thank you very much. And to complete the overview is of why this this multipolarization, we started talking about this earlier, but I wonder if we could expand a little bit on the strategic calculations of the Gulf countries in terms of, for instance, something that we have touched upon a little bit, building an indigenous defense industry, but also supporting new regional ambitions and possibly also gaining leverage over traditional partners. We've talked a little bit about the niche products that that either China and or Russia, for instance, have been trying to sell or have been selling to the Gulf countries. And so what is this, how does it fit into the strategic calculations of Gulf countries, basically? So maybe Shana, if you could start us off on this.
Sure. The development of an indigenous defense industrial base has always been a hallmark of a regional hegemon, right? So if you think about any of the other world regions, there's one country in each of those regions, at least one, that is like a second tier or relatively high ranking producer of defense products, right? So South Africa has an enormous defense industry. India and Pakistan have large defense industries, as does China. You have Brazil. And thinking about this actually made me think about this article written, I think, in the 90s by Ian Lustig, which is very well known. And the title is, "Why Isn't There a Middle East Great Power?" The way there are great powers in some of these other regions. And even a casual observer would say, well, maybe because there's no actual country in the region that produces defense equipment, right? And because arms sales and arms transfers are such an integral part of foreign policy, it's very difficult to have a very influential foreign policy if you can't back that up with some sort of arms transfer or arms sales from your own indigenous defense industry. So after really, decades of engaging in massive purchases of extremely expensive weapon systems from the US and Europe, the Gulf states are very good at navigating the defense industry, right? So they know a lot about procurement decisions. They know a lot about what defense partnerships production partnerships are supposed to look like with private sector actors. They know a lot about the engineering and technical specifications of a lot of weapon systems, and you see them starting to put that to use in the formation of partnerships. They're purchasing wholesale, foreign suppliers and moving their production lines to the Gulf states. They're financing enormous R&D facilities and university programs meant to train generations of Gulf residents in engineering and technical skills that you need for a defense industry. And because they have such an enormous access to financial capital, it's very easy for them to do that, because a lot of European and American defense firms want to move where the money is, right? So they already have sales offices. Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed, BAE, they all have huge sales offices in the region. So why not set up larger subsidiary operations there and productive partnerships and stuff there? Because a lot of the engineers and the executives and the people that work in these firms are more than willing to move to the Gulf, where the salaries are very high, and they can use that money to attract a lot of talent on the business side and on the technical side. And so they've been doing that really for a decade or a little more. And you can really see how much that sort of all in, throwing money at the problem has produced in terms of developing a domestic defense industry in the region. And that gives them a lot of leverage over their traditional partners, like the US and Europe, because they're basically siphoning away, some certain aspects of what a future defense industry is going to look like. One that's very much focused on things like surveillance and machine learning, which is all about funding. Do you have the funding to bring these scientists and these huge projects over to the Gulf? And I think it's very clear that they do have the money to do that, and they're willing to spend the money to get those people where they want them.
Thank you. And one important aspect that you mentioned, and obviously it was also present in other answers, is the political aspect of arms trade, and it's especially in this case of developing a local defense industry or indigenous capabilities. The question, and I would turn to Pieter maybe for this, do we believe that these indigenous defense capabilities could become anything more than a political message, basically like a statement, and a new way also of redistributing the oil wealth in part. And my question is more specifically, for instance, do you see a future where the Gulf countries could have indigenous defense capabilities in niche products, for instance, in line with their new partners?
I think one of the answers to that question lies a little bit in looking at the history of arms industries elsewhere in the world. As already was mentioned, in some cases, the development of an arms industry is driven by the desire to be a regional power. In other cases, it is more related to the desire to have certain strategic independence. And in other cases, it's primarily a question of maintaining at least some of the money which is spent on military products in your own country. And I think they often, of course, combine. And there are different examples of that. We already heard of those countries for which it partly at least is part of their efforts to become a regional power. For China, that's for certain the case. For others, that's much less the case. Take, for example, Sweden, where I'm now, has a very sophisticated and well-developed arms industry, but it's not particularly large as a country, nor is its military spending particularly high if you compare that, for example, with that of Saudi Arabia. Still, it has that desire to be independent, to be non-aligned, and as part of that, it has always promoted the need for an arms industry. And I think all those things play. You can then compare this to what is happening in the Gulf region. I think that one of the aspects which was mentioned, the ability to be able to not only provide yourself with the weapons and the ammunitions and the components, and also kind of the capability to maintain arms even if you are kind of cut off for a certain time by one of your suppliers. That is very important, but also the capability to make things which you can then supply to others without the original supplier complaining about that, because that is what we see, of course, right now. The UAE supplying arms to some of its proxies throughout the Middle East, whether that's in Yemen or whether that's in Libya or elsewhere, but then being criticized or even being reprimanded by the original suppliers because this was not in the original deal. They were not supposed to re-export the items which they have received from others. When it comes to the development of the arms industry, well, of course, we have to see what will happen there. Remember the case of Brazil, which during the 80s built up an arms industry primarily because it could sell weapons to the Middle East, to both Iran and Iraq. I think at that time that was an important market. And on the basis of that, their industry developed fast. But then it basically collapsed because the internal market was by far not enough to sustain that industry. Now it's kind of returning a bit now and all that, but it does show the difficulties of maintaining an arms industry. Of course, it's different in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, where there is a very high level of national spending. On the basis of that, you can, just as in, let's say, Japan or South Korea, which is a very good example of a recent country that has developed a significant arms industry, you can sustain a lot. But you need to have that technical infrastructure, that basis, which means, like in the case of South Korea, that you have an industry which can produce so many other things, an R&D infrastructure, and all those things, a educational infrastructure that allows you to kind of get the people and to develop a basis on which you can actually then develop an arms industry that is functional and sustainable. Will that happen? We'll see. Right now, what I personally see is primarily an industry that, which has already been said in a way, is primarily importing the technology, the brains. If you look at the arms industry in Saudi Arabia, one of the recent things they did is basically buy up most of the most qualified engineers from the South African arms industry, which is in a complete crisis. So they just buy them up and bring them to Saudi Arabia to be able to build up an arms industry there. If that is sustainable in the long term, we have to see. And of course, finally, for any more advanced product you want to make, let's say a combat aircraft, you almost certainly we have to turn to partners elsewhere. You're not going to be able to produce the whole thing by yourself. Very few countries are able to do so. Not even China has yet reached that level to the extent they want to. A country like China is still dependent, to some extent at least, on engines from Russia to make combat aircraft. So if China cannot do that, then yet at least, when can we expect Saudi Arabia or the UAE to reach that level? And I think we don't even have to consider the other Gulf regions in that regard.
So, thank you so much. Yeah, certainly. I mean, I don't think that besides possibly the US, but not even no country in the world today is self-sufficient in terms of arms trade. But that's a very good point. And maybe to turn back to the political aspects of and geopolitical aspects of this, maybe turn to the idea that this diversification of partnerships and including arms suppliers is a way, or is at least thought as a way to gain leverage on traditional partners. I don't know if maybe Bilal, you would like to say a word on this.
I mean, leverage for what? You know, we're desperate to sell these guys whatever they want. I mean, with a few exceptions with the F-35 platform, I mean, we're pretty much selling them everything they want, right? And so, I mean, I'll give you the example of the THAAD, for example. The Saudis didn't want it. I know that for sure. And we basically forced it on them. So if there are certain platforms where they really want to buy from us, but they're not getting, and so they use this as leverage, maybe. But in most other applications, we're the ones who are desperate. It's not them at this point, specifically and now in this context of great power competition with the Chinese and the Russians. Trump's conventional arms transfer policy is so aggressive in tone. It's actually not that different in substance from Obama's, but in tone, that it actually automatically, by default, gives these guys the advantage over us, right? So you got to ask yourself, when we talk about leverage, what for? Is it for us to pursue certain policies that, you know, in the region that they might favor, that they find in their own interest? I think that's a stretch. But when it comes to specifically the space of arms trade, they already have it. I don't think there's really anything that they need to do other than just us force it down on them, basically, whether it's missile defense systems, whether it's any other types of platforms, with, once again, one or two exceptions, just that we to make sure that we keep the issue of Israel's qualitative military edge, which, by the way, these days is a much reduced concern. It's not like it used to be back in the day. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, you're right. To what end? And you covered the arms trade pretty in a pretty straightforward way. Maybe the leverage might also be to have some geopolitical concession and have the traditional partners take their assertive interest in the region, for instance, more taken into account. And that's kind of the question. And that leads me to talk about or ask you about, could we actually say that that the multipolarization of the of international relations of the Gulf, including in defense and security today, is happening with or without the US on board in terms of evolving geopolitics of the region and what it implies for regional security? I would turn to Jon maybe, and then Alexandra.
Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind is that the first preference of all these states is still to have a close relationship with the United States. It's not like people are trying to replace the United States with somebody else, with some other patron. Every time the US tries to do multilateral defensive arrangements, the GCC +2, whatever we want to call it, MISA, it falls apart because these states want bilateral relations with the United States. GCC +2 is actually GCC -5. They just want us. And I think it's easy to miss that fact because of a sense that we're declining, that we lose sight of the starting points, which is the United States is by far the preponderant military and intelligence force in the Gulf. We have capabilities, we have assets that no country or collection of countries can replicate. And while there's a trend line that Middle Eastern countries find distressing, the fact is we're starting from a very high base, and the Chinese and the Russians and everybody else are starting from an infinitesimally low base in many ways. They can pick apart, they can try to untie some of the alliances, they can try to create friction with the United States and others. But I think from the perspective of the states, I am struck at how different conversations with the United States are than with any other country, how much more intimate the conversations are with the United States than the other country. I've witnessed some of these conversations in various languages. They're very interesting and they're very, very different. And really the first choice of all of these countries is not how do we get away from the United States, but how do we get the United States to do what it's done in the past? My perspective on the US debate is that ship has sailed, that the US isn't going to do for the next 20 years what it's done for the last 20 years in the Middle East. I'm not sure there are many people who argue it should, but I think it's not going to happen. And then the question is what does it look like going forward? I suspect that a different administration would be more circumspect about that, would be more strategic about it, would be more intentional about it than the Trump administration has been. As Bilal said, there's been a huge commercial focus at the expense of strategic thinking. There's a limit to what we can do, and we've seen that in how limited the success has been setting up multipolar or multilateral arrangements in the region. But I think we could certainly be more intentional than we've been, and I think we will be more intentional than we've been. It's just you currently have an administration which is very directed toward commercial sales and very directed toward relationships and sustaining the status quo. At the same time, it says that the status quo is the biggest mistake we ever made. I think that's going to work itself out. And what it will work toward, I think, is the United States facilitating a transition to a different US role, a different role for other parties. And I think we'll do that unevenly and to some degree with support, to some degree with tension from the region, some degree a sense of abandonment from the region. But I think, to my mind, there's little question that over the next 10 years, there's going to be a rethinking on all sides about what the relationship is going to be going forward.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, you did cover a lot, and the idea that the Gulf countries are not in any way seriously trying to replace the US is an important point. And I would turn to, well, so because you have the Gulf countries.
Every country in the region.
Yeah.
And every country in the Gulf. Right, we're back in Saudi Arabia. We have a presence that nobody else replicates that, let alone the hardware, let alone the weapon systems, which we can talk about, and other things.
And I would turn to Alexandra maybe to comment on, do we actually have an ambition from other countries to even try and replace the US? Because it seems the US is not really going away, and the Gulf countries don't really want the US to go away. But what about these new outside powers really?
Yeah, sure. To answer your question, I would like to give more general comment in the beginning. I would like to say that the globalization of arms trade is happening. And as Pieter mentioned, and I mentioned also, that arms market has been dominated by the Western arms producers, Russia, Then China has emerged as a competitor to the West and Russia. Then at the same time, other arms exporters like Australia, Israel, South Korea are trying to develop or already have developed significant arms producing capabilities. And in addition, more and more arms industry cooperation agreements are being developed or signed within emerging non-Western or established Western arms suppliers, plus including the Gulf states. So the global arms trade network is becoming more and more complex, and the Gulf states kind of taking part in there. And arms trade, since you also asked in the beginning about geopolitics of arms trade. So arms trade is a tool everybody knows in the framework of countries' broader economic and foreign policy. So increasing arms producing capabilities and arms export capabilities are seen as an instrument of political influence. So the emergence of new arms producers and exporters may become a game changer. So that is what is important to know when we talk about emerging arms exporters to the region, or for instance, that the region is, the Gulf countries is intended to develop arms production capabilities. And multipolarization is happening, and yet with the US on board, of course. However, we will see what will happen next, maybe not in near future, but developments are happening. So we just need to pay attention.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to keep up at the same time with all the questions that we're receiving, and it's they are like, let me close this. Yes, thank you very much. I think maybe before we move on to the questions of the audience, because they are a lot. Yes, Bilal, would you jump in?
I just want to make a quick point about the multipolar nature of Gulf security now. There are obviously some spaces, I think we all agree now, where we want to jealously guard, right? You want to be the go-to source for arms. These countries certainly don't want to compete with the Russians and the Chinese, right? So that's one space that we have no interest in opening up. But there have been other spaces that we've been, not just over the past few months, but over the past few years, been trying to open up desperately. And that's at sea. So, and that has, I'm not going to give any credit to the president on this. I think this is all really kudos to the leadership of NAFSAN. They've been thinking about this for quite a long time. Keep in mind, the great power competition concept didn't start with this administration. I mean, really, at least the philosophy of it started with the Obama administration, right? Then it just basically got coded, became official with the Trump administration, and specifically with Secretary Mattis, right? But this process of inviting others to contribute to regional security at sea has been going on for some time, and it finally has culminated in Operation Sentinel. I'm not going to exaggerate the significance of it, but to dismiss it also would be a mistake. I think that really now this is an international effort to try to secure the waters of the Persian Gulf. We're not there yet to invite the Russians and the Chinese for a number of reasons. I think John would know much more about that. Not just an issue of capabilities, but we're just still not sure about Chinese intentions and whether really we are comfortable about bringing them over into such a strategic space. But at some point down the road, as relations develop, improve with the Chinese, they have to be brought in. I mean, there's no chance that we're going to continue to be the sole guardian of that region and allow the Chinese to free ride. It's just strategic lunacy. I think the United States has finally recognized that. It's just a matter of continuing to put in additional building blocks on that effort, which started, frankly, I would say, almost a decade ago, right? And now has culminated with Operation Sentinel that has now brought in the British, the Australians, okay, the Albanians, fine, less significant, and a number of Gulf countries that would include the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and soon enough, I would believe, the Kuwaitis and the Qataris. All of these also are part of Combined Maritime Forces Task Force, right? That has been going on for some time too. A lot of this is because of the leadership of the US Navy. And because it's such a long-term project, the US Navy is so well positioned to at least think about it strategically, if only they can get a little bit better policy direction and policy guidance from the administration. So I'm not going to give the administration credit, but at least the military leadership for now to at least start executing the new priority of great power competition, at least at sea in the Persian Gulf.
And which frankly, just one sentence, has a lot to do with how the Navy thinks about China globally, because the Navy can't help but think of China globally.
Thank you. Yeah, actually, it's a perfect transition. I think we're gonna soon move on to all the questions from the audience. I would like to give you all an opportunity to maybe comment on what should be undertaken by traditional partners, obviously the US, but also European partners in this changing environment, before we jump into more specific questions from the audience. So I don't know who would like to start. Pieter? You're muted, Pieter. We can't hear you.
Yeah, we haven't really talked much about the role of the European suppliers yet. And of course, that's a very important role. Some of them have very important strategic relationships with, in particular with Saudi Arabia when it comes to the UK. France plays a bigger role, or has played a bigger role in the UAE, has now also kind of re-established some, let's say, new arms trade relationships with Saudi Arabia. European suppliers play a very important role in Kuwait still, very important role in Qatar, in competition with the US, and to some extent in competition with each other, in competition also with China and Russia to a much lesser extent. But of course in Europe we see a slightly different discussion. I think we see that several states have really become very wary of continuing that relationship with that arms trade relationship with Saudi Arabia in particular, and also to some extent with the UAE. That has changed, let's say, maybe the perspective of also Saudi Arabia and the UAE on whether or not these countries are reliable suppliers. Now, I have to immediately say that even though the discussion is ongoing in parts of Europe, the reality is that very few European states have truly introduced restrictions, real restrictions on arms exports to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It's only really Germany that matters because they are a major supplier of arms in general, and they have basically stopped those supplies to those two countries. And there are a few smaller suppliers such as Sweden and Norway and a few others, but they don't really matter that much. So the Europeans are still very much kind of discussing this as it is now. They are likely to continue to play an important role in arms exports to the region. And again, also here, as has been mentioned, also with regards to the actual flow of technology and knowledge, both technical knowledge and management knowledge, that where you see that people who work in the European industry are now moving to work in the industry in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So I think that's where we maybe thought there would be some change on the basis of the very let's say widespread criticism of how Saudi Arabia uses the weapons it receives from Europe, particularly in Yemen, and also within the country itself. I think the result is still that most governments in Europe have chosen not to really be bothered too much with that, and just continue on the same level as they did before. And considering the situation which we are in now, where industries are hit very hard by the restrictions related to the corona virus, I think we can also see that the pressure to, let's say, continue such arms exports for purely economic reasons will only increase and therefore decrease the pressure to stop any arms exports for reasons of concerns about Yemen or human rights in Saudi Arabia or the UAE.
Thank you, Pieter. Alexandra, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Pieter. You covered the European perspective in a way, and what I want to say, I will try to be short, that I guess there are two ways that at least European traditional partners could deal with the changing environment. First way is just to accept the changing environment, but I guess that's not that easy, and that's not going to happen. And the second way is to try to strengthen their roles in the Gulf, putting the centrality of the Gulf countries' interest first, and to try to address challenges that the Gulf countries face that can actually strengthen the role of European, the traditional partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Shana?
I mean, I guess a lot of this question revolves around to what extent the Gulf states can operate independently with whatever weapons technologies they possess. And that is clearly the most likely case in the domestic environment, right? So in terms of domestic repression or influencing sort of low-level regional political contests, and things like this, they don't need U.S. Fighter jets. Saudi Arabia doesn't need U.S. fighter jets to keep President Sisi in control of Egypt, right? They just need the money that they already have and access to things like domestic surveillance technologies and other kinds of technologies that the Gulf states have clearly been very willing to finance and provide to governments like Sisi's in Egypt. And so I think it depends on what sort of level of operation we're talking about when we're talking about how independent the Gulf states are in terms of their abilities to carry out their own goals without sort of the US or the Europeans trying to steer them in a different direction. They obviously can't produce their own fighter planes or missile defense systems or other enormous weapon systems like that. But frankly, those aren't the kinds of systems or the kinds of technologies that matter in most cases on a day-to-day basis for the lives of the vast majority of people that live in the Middle East. And so in that respect, I see their ability to use the capital that they have and the enormous leverage that provides as being sort of the most influential component in terms of what they're able to do in the rest of the region and how they're able to influence politics.
Thank you, Shana. Bilal, do you want to go next? Oh, Jon, I'm gonna actually at the same time look at the questions. Yeah, I would be interested in having your comments on this, Jon. And a question is directed to you, which is, what should the U.S. be doing to preserve its security dominance in the Gulf? Should the U.S. try to preserve all or part of the relationships with the GCC? Can any other country actually fill in what we covered that part a little bit? Can any other country actually fill in behind the US if we choose to pull back from the Gulf?
So, I mean, the big question is, what are you protecting against? And there is a view that some people in the Obama administration had that the US, by continuing to put its thumb on the scale in the region, kept the region on pins and needles, that the US contributed to a security dilemma in the region, that everything the countries did defensively was perceived as offensive by an adversary, which prompted the adversary to do more things that our partners decided was offensive itself, and created more defensive needs, which created more offensive abilities, and it goes on and on and on. And so there's a theory that if the US were to diminish its influence, that would actually be better, and that would increase security in the Gulf. There's also an argument that countries would act in a more aggressive way if they felt they had to act on their own. And you could see the Saudi actions in Yemen as a response to Saudi Arabia and the UAE deciding they can't rely on the United States, have to take matters into their own hands. And so US withdrawal would create more instability and not less instability. Would the Iranians treat a smaller US presence as an invitation to wreak more havoc, or would it treat it as an opportunity to spend less money on unconventional forces and more money on the Iranian population, which is in a bad place, in a place that's getting significantly worse? You know, ultimately, these are judgment questions. There's not a clear-cut answer to how the region would respond. I think the region is mostly on edge because of uncertainty about US intentions and uncertainty about what the US will do. And in some ways, the US gets the worst of all possible worlds, except for, and this goes to Bilal's point, a sense that governments are going to buy more in the near term to keep the US in the game, because that's what this administration responds to. But I think if we're fair, we have to appreciate that everything the US does to advance security in the Gulf doesn't advance security. Some of it advances insecurity. Some of it advances the need for the US to be there rather than the region being more secure, more stable, more predictable.
Bilal, did you want to jump on this?
Just very quickly, I think we all agree here that this is really less about number of troops, number of assets that we have in the region. It's more about what we do, the very substance, the content of our policies, right? But there is a point to be made about our presence, which is overbearing. It is over assertive. I think it creates a sense of complacency on the part of the Gulf partners. How can I convince the Kuwaitis, for example, to better defend their borders when I have 8,000 troops in Kuwait? How can I convince the Bahrainis to invest in maritime capabilities when the Fifth Fleet is headquartered in Manama? How can I convince many other countries where we have a significant presence to really do the right things as far as military development and defense development when we're there all the time 24/7? So there is a point to be made about the presence itself, but it is not the most important point to be made. And the Pentagon has yet to make that serious examination of its defense posture in the region. You know, there's been a conversation for some time now about how many and to do what, but the Pentagon is nowhere near, you know, that point of reducing troops. As a matter of fact, we keep sending more and more. And as John has mentioned, hey, we're back to Saudi Arabia. Can you believe that?
Shana?
I was just going to say, it's not just, of course, about official troops, right? It's this enormous number of private sector contractors that are there managing the weapon systems, right? So BAE has more employees in Saudi Arabia than they do in the UK, right? So there's an enormous commercial interest bound up in this that has nothing to do with policy, but is all about the commercial financial interests of these massive multinational defense firms who fund the think tanks that write the research that says we need to maintain large troop presence in the region. So it's a cycle that is very clear, but it's not all about what's coming down from the top levels of policy making. It's also about what's getting pushed up from the basic sort of professional and personal and private financial interests of the people that operate these industries.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all your answers. That was a question from Doug Silliman. And I think that it also tied into a question asked by Anel Shalin. And I think we covered that question. I'm going to try and group the numerous questions. So bear with me as I try and do this while on the line with everyone. There are a couple of questions on arms sales, specifically a question by David DeRoche, who asked, how can we best measure weapon sales? The dollar value is easy, but that leads to distortions. And I think I saw another questions about arms sale. Oh, yeah. Is there any evidence of, it's another question from Doug Silliman. Is there any evidence of coordinated weapons purchases among GCC states, especially between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that would permit balanced and integrated security forces and strategies? With that, I will turn to Pieter, I think, and or Alexandra.
Yeah, if you want to understand the arms flows to the region, there are several ways to do that. You can use the official information that is provided by states. For example, the US provides information about the dollar value of the items that are being supplied. But other countries do that to a much lesser extent. You wouldn't find any such information from China. We have no idea how much in money terms China actually exports to the region. So at Soubrier, we have developed another method already long ago where we basically look at the kind of systems which are being supplied. We try to find out how many are being supplied. We focus on the major arms, not on all the other equipment, not on the training and all that. But based on that, we kind of create what we call a trend indicator value. And on the basis of that, we can make some general statements about what the overall trend and patterns are. So which are most likely the largest suppliers, which countries are the most important importing countries in the region. And combining this information, I think we have just sketched that whole picture already before. And I think especially in the case of the Middle East, we can be quite sure that what we measure with these rather crude tools gives us a pretty good idea. Again, being that it is primarily the US, Western Europe that are by far the largest suppliers to the countries in the Gulf, though that there are some changes ongoing there, and it's going to be interesting to see how that will develop over time. The other question, how, and I think others may have more to say about that, but whether or not these countries really integrate their acquisitions, from what I see, I kind of have my doubts, because it seems that they're very much buying equipment very much on a national basis. This is not necessarily different from what other parts of the world do too, even in Europe, where we have NATO and other kind of defense cooperation schemes. I think we even see there that countries do very much still make their own choices. So it's not very surprising. But I think in the Arab states, I think I would myself assess that there's not much in terms of real cooperation in trying to acquire the systems and kind of connect them together. But that'd be very interesting to hear from the others if they have a different view, if they have different information about that.
Thank you, Pieter. Alexandra, did you want to jump in?
Just a couple of words that, first of all, I think Pieter gave a brilliant answer to the question, and I agree with him for 100%. And just to mention that when I gave my first intervention, all the statistics, figures, shares I provided are based and taken from the Soubrier Arms Transfer Database. And if you want to see the volume of arms transferred, exported, imported, I think Soubrier Arms Transfer Database is the best source to get this information. Yeah, thank you.
Did anyone want to jump in on the common purchase system, or should we move on to the next question?
Just very quickly, Emma, I mean, we try to do that on the missile defense front with us being the orchestrators, but we failed miserably. If the levels of interoperability between the United States and individual Gulf countries are not very high, you can imagine that among them are either non-existent or completely deficient. But I think that Pieter is absolutely right. And this is where it gets difficult to actually access those things because they're quite sensitive. But I don't see any clear evidence or example of countries coordinating basically on weapon systems in order to achieve interoperability in the region. What they typically do is that if there's a certain purchase that they really covet, they would talk amongst themselves for one to apply pressure on Washington to sell that system to the other, basically. And this is what has happened every now and then between the Saudis and the Emiratis. They'll band together and then they'll say, all right, well, we'll talk to the Americans and then we'll try to convince them to sell you X, Y, or Z. But on the military side of things, that has not happened to my knowledge, at least.
Thank you very much. So we're gonna move on to next. There's a couple of questions about related to oil. So we have a question from Oliver B. John from Astrolab Global Strategy, asking, how do you foresee the collapse of the OPEC Plus agreement and the Saudis' Russian oil production conflict impacting the arms relationship with the GCC in the near term? There is also a question from Jean-François Sesnek, asking, what will be the effect of the collapse in oil prices have on the effort of the Gulf countries, especially of Saudi Arabia, to develop a significant defense equipment industry? And then finally, moving to Zoom, we have a question from Emily Hawthorne, Middle East analyst at Stratford. What is the impact of a low oil price environment on the GCC states' procurement of arms and equipment? So those group question, I don't know who would like to answer this.
So, just before we got on, there was a headline that the U.S. was going to try to use a G20 mechanism to end the Russian-Saudi price war. So I don't know where we're going to be on oil prices in 3 months' time. Certainly, COVID-19 is depressing oil prices. Depressed oil prices and reduced economic activity also mean that alternative development is likely to be suppressed. I mean, there are a whole bunch of questions. It seems to me, though, as everybody in this panel understands, arms deals are multi-year engagements, and I would expect a lot of projects to be abandoned before countries abandon efforts to acquire arms. Now, the other thing about arms deals is, I think everybody in this panel also understands, is they can be drawn out for years and years and years. So while it might not affect countries' strategies for what they want to acquire, it's easy to kick off an acquisition for 6 months or a year until there's greater clarity on what resources will be like. So I would imagine that it will not slow down the deal making, but it'll slow down the consummation delivery of deals, which arguably won't really change the strategic picture at all.
Thank you. Yes, Shana?
Historically, when you've had problems with low oil prices, you've seen barter arrangements, sort of long-term barter arrangements with US and European countries for huge multi-year weapon systems contracts, which benefits both because then the Saudis or Emiratis don't have to come up with hard currency for these purchases. The oil refiners in the US and Europe, or the petrochemical companies, end up benefiting a lot because they're getting the oil from these countries, and then they're able to benefit financially by refining it and turning it into petroleum products. And the US and European defense industries, the firms themselves benefit a lot from this because it's a very long-term agreement, and they can borrow on financial markets on the expectation of these future profits. So those arrangements in the past have been, I think, a factor when oil prices were low. So I would see that as probably being something that they would do moving forward. And also a lot of the demands and requirements that the Gulf states made in the past in order to get, in order for the firms themselves to make the sales, they would have to make all kinds of agreements, offset agreements to transfer production of particular components to Saudi factories or to Emirati factories. If they're not paying as much, if they're not able to pay as much because they don't have as much oil income because prices are low, then they may just abandon those additional demands, and then the agreements can still go forward. So I see sort of those sorts of market modifications or purchase modifications maybe being made if they can't, if they don't want to make that huge purchase up front because they expect income from oil to dwindle in the future.
Thank you. I think, Pieter, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'm not an oil price expert, but of course, there's some long-term thinking there too, where Saudi Arabia may believe that it may actually come out of this price war and kind of in a, for them, economically positive way. But part of this whole discussion is, of course, also that the volatility of the oil price is exactly one of the reasons why a country like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for that matter too, want to invest in their own arms industry, want to be able to develop that, and in the belief, and the question is there if there is a belief or if there is some truth to it, that building up an arms industry also means building up your own technical capabilities, and therefore you would benefit from some sort of spin-off effect of having an arms industry that can boost your economy and that also makes your economy more driven by other things than oil. And I think that's one of the considerations which I can see that would play a role in the how a country like Saudi Arabia would go ahead with arms purchases even now at this point in time. At the same time, just a few years back, we had a very significant drop in oil prices too. At that time, Saudi Arabian military expenditure, as far as we know, was at a high point of something like 90 billion. And as soon as the oil price dropped, we saw that the military spending also dropped by, I think it went down by like 25 billion or so in 1 or 2 years. So it's very clear that such volatility in oil prices has a direct effect on military spending, particularly in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much. If all the speakers are okay with this, I'm going to move on to 3 new questions. There was a question by Nadim Shahadi saying, I understand the emphasis on arms in the panel. My question is about the supreme instrument of power that the US has, which is the dollar as a global reserve currency. Would that not be severely dented if the Gulf starts trading its oil eastwards in an alternative currency? And I will add 2 other questions. Charles Forrester asks, could the panel comment on the chilling effect of the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, so CAATSA, on countries in the region and potential acquisitions from Russia? And then finally, but it was through email, a question from Jamal Bafagi. In the recent past, some regional countries were seen to move towards normalizing relations with Iran. What, in your opinion, is the main reason for that, and what does the US feel? How does the US feel about that? So I don't know. Bilal, you seem to say that you're leaving soon. Do you want to jump in on any of those questions?
Me? No, I'm still around. No,
okay. Sorry. All right. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread. So Pieter, do you want to jump in?
I think these are a bit outside my. Well, the question about cuts, I think, is interesting. Does it have an effect? It's almost a bit too early to really judge it. In some cases, it does have an effect, but then again, it's very hard to see behind the scenes to which extent, for example, a country like Saudi Arabia has chosen not to go for certain Russian systems at this point in time. I think we have too little information to really be able to judge that very well.
May I just jump in?
Yes.
Just to support Peter's answer that yes, it's very hard to say what can happen with CAATSA. And just to clarify, the CAATSA sanctions were made in a way to threaten countries to procure arms from Russia. And however, it's very interesting to see the impact of CAATSA because it didn't work out for Turkey, for example. Turkey still ordered and got air defense systems, S-400. So, and nothing happened yet in relation to CAATSA sanctions, or like there are some, of course, discussion developments, but yeah, it happened anyways. But it's very difficult to, supporting Peter's point, that it's very difficult to say what can happen with countries in the Gulf region.
Oh, thank you.
I can mention something about the fact that, you know, the dollar is the reserve currency, which of course makes it very easy for the U.S. to borrow on global markets and at low rates and all of this, all of the other benefits that come from that. But it's also the fact that, you know, the Gulf states hold an enormous amount, I think, of U.S. Treasury securities. And they're also enormous investors in a lot of U.S. sectors, including Silicon Valley. So that, you know, any leverage that the Americans have over the Saudis because of the dollar as the reserve currency, and the reason that, and oil being traded in dollars, also works the other way, because there's so much capital, Saudi capital, that's flowing through all of these industries in the U.S. and then also propping up the U.S. government's ability to borrow in global markets because they hold so many treasury securities and are very willing to keep buying them. It works both ways, and I don't know which way the leverage is more powerful from the U.S. Over the GCC or the GCC over the U.S., but I'm guessing that it's shifting in favor of the GCC countries increasingly.
Although it would strike me that the economic message sent by the Gulf states getting off a dollar peg would hurt the Gulf states a lot more than it would hurt the United States. I mean, they're marginal in terms of US markets. We are fundamental in terms of their own financial stability.
Thank you. John, did you want to add anything? But we're gonna wrap up soon because we're actually.
Just on normalization with Iran, I don't think any country in the region is trying to normalize with Iran. I think countries are trying to reduce tensions with Iran. That's partly because they think we won't be there, and certainly the attack on Abqaiq and Khurais and the relatively muted U.S. response contributed to a sense that they had to, if not appease, at least assuage Iranian concerns. Whether you consider that to be a capitulation to the Iranians or a useful way for the region to reach its own equilibrium depends on your view of Iran. But I don't think it's about normalization. I think it's about reducing tensions, and the Gulf has had a series of efforts to reduce tensions, and then times when tensions increase. I mean, it's not been a flat line at all. And it seems to me that starting with what were presumed to be Iranian attacks last spring, there was an effort in the Gulf to try to lower the temperature a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we had, unfortunately, we had to, Pieter had to leave, and I'm actually gonna ask all of you, because we're out of time, and I'm sorry for that, but I'll ask all of you if you want to have a few last comments to wrap it up, so we can finish the conference. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'll give it to you, Bilal.
I just feel bad because there was a good question about education. So long story short about education, yeah, it's a major pillar of, creating an arms industry, but what they're going for here is really niche stuff. So most of that learning they're not getting from the educational system, they're getting it from the joint ventures and the offsets that Shana talked about. It's really precise learning here. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Shana, did you want to have a last?
Sure. I mean, someone did have a question about the centrality of these much sort of cheaper methods of influencing politics in the region, right? So, surveillance technologies and cyber and social media surveillance technologies, and the fact that the Gulf states are clearly very able to get access to those technologies and use them to great effect in the region, both in their own domestic political situations and also in the broader region as well, which does require, obviously, less manpower, as the question pointed out, but can be incredibly disruptive and really requires money for the purchase of these technologies and bringing over a small number of very highly qualified engineers and technicians. So I think that's probably an area in which they will continue to excel and continue to be able to influence politics beyond what their sort of big hardware would suggest.
Thank you very much. Alexandra, did you want to say a last word?
Actually, what I want to say is I just want to thank you all for this great discussion, because I think it was very interesting and we covered a lot of questions and issues. And I just want to say that if we haven't answered questions, especially from my side related to arms trade, then audience, of course, can contact us via email or through other sources. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. John?
I'm good, thanks.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all of our speakers and everyone in the audience. I would like to apologize if some of your answers were not addressed. I think Alexandra just said it. Don't hesitate to contact the speakers, and or AGSIW will be happy to direct you to anyone who can answer your questions. And thank you again. This conversation has been recorded. It will be online at some point, so stay tuned. And yeah, again, thank you. A tremendous thank you to everyone for this first exercise for AGSIW and for letting me be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.